The certified letter arrived on a Wednesday morning, wedged between credit card offers and grocery store circulars. Sarah Mitchell nearly tossed it aside while rushing to get Tommy ready for school, but the embossed letterhead caught her eye. Hartwell Associates, Estate Law. Her coffee mug slipped from her fingers, shattering against the kitchen tile as memories she'd buried for 15 years came flooding back. James Hartwell was gone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah stood frozen in her modest Hartford apartment, staring at the formal notification of James Hartwell's passing. The same man who had built a construction empire from nothing, the same man who had given her a roof over her head when she was just 7 years old, the same man who had thrown her out 15 years ago when she refused to marry the son of his business partner. The letter trembled in her hands as she read the final line requesting her presence at the reading of his last will and testament at the family estate in Millbrook. Tommy emerged from his bedroom, backpack slung over his shoulder, and immediately noticed the broken mug and his mother's pale complexion. At 16, he had inherited Sarah's intuitive nature and could read her moods like weather patterns. He knew the signs of an approaching storm. "Mom, what's wrong?" he asked, his voice carrying the careful concern of a teenager who had watched his mother work 2 jobs while putting herself through night school to become a teacher. She had never spoken much about her past, only that they were better off on their own, and that family wasn't always about blood. Sarah folded the letter carefully, her hands steadying as she made a decision that had been building in her chest since the moment she saw that letterhead. "Pack your good clothes tonight, Tommy. We're going to Millbrook this weekend." She didn't explain further, couldn't explain the complexity of returning to a world that had cast her aside. Tommy had never met the Hartwells, had never even heard their names spoken in their small apartment. To him, their family began and ended with each other, and that had always been enough. The drive to Millbrook took 45 minutes, but it felt like traveling back through time. Sarah remembered being 12 years old, pressed against the window of James's Cadillac as they drove through these same tree-lined streets for the first time. She had clutched a plastic bag containing everything she owned, and wondered if this new family would keep her longer than the others. The Hartwells had seemed like royalty then, living in their sprawling colonial with its circular driveway and manicured gardens. James had been kind in his reserved way, while his biological children, David and Rebecca, had made it clear from day one that she was temporary help, not family. Now, 15 years later, Sarah pulled her aging Honda into that same circular driveway, past the Mercedes and BMW sedans that belonged to David and Rebecca. The house looked exactly the same, its white columns and black shutters maintaining their stately elegance. But Sarah was different. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been shuffled from foster home to foster home before landing with the Hartwells. She was a woman who had built her own life, raised her son with values she had learned through struggle, not inheritance, and found peace in small moments rather than grand gestures. Tommy climbed out of the passenger seat and whistled low under his breath. "You grew up here?" His voice carried a mixture of awe and confusion. Their apartment could fit into the Hartwell foyer, and his mother drove a car that rattled on cold mornings. Nothing about their modest lifestyle had prepared him for this level of wealth. Sarah nodded but didn't elaborate. How could she explain that she had lived in this house for 11 years but had never truly belonged to it? How could she tell her son that sometimes the most beautiful cages were still prisons? The front door opened before they reached the porch, and David Hartwell emerged like a king surveying his domain. At 45 he had inherited his father's broad shoulders, but none of his warmth. His expensive suit couldn't hide the softness around his middle that came from too many business lunches, and his smile never quite reached his eyes. Behind him stood Victoria, his wife of 20 years whose plastic surgery had frozen her face into a permanent expression of mild disapproval. They looked like they were posing for a magazine spread about successful suburban families, all surface polish with nothing authentic underneath. "Well, well," David said, his voice carrying the same condescending tone Sarah remembered from her teenage years. "Sarah Martinez, right? Or did you change your name when you ran off?" The deliberate mispronunciation of her chosen surname stung exactly as he intended. Even after 15 years, David couldn't resist the small cruelties that had made her adolescence miserable. Victoria stepped closer to her husband, as if Sarah might contaminate them with her middle-class existence. Her eyes swept over Sarah's modest black dress and Tommy's carefully pressed khakis with the kind of assessment reserved for judging livestock at county fairs. Sarah straightened her shoulders and met David's gaze directly. "It's Mitchell now. This is my son Tommy." She placed a protective hand on Tommy's shoulder, feeling him tense beside her as he picked up on the hostile undercurrents. Tommy had inherited more than just her intuition, he had also developed her fierce protective instincts when it came to family. David's expression shifted slightly as he took in Tommy's height and the intelligence behind his eyes. At 16, Tommy already showed signs of the man he would become, and it was clear he wouldn't be easily intimidated. "Your son," David repeated, as if testing the words for authenticity. "Interesting. I didn't know you had managed to—" He paused, searching for the most cutting way to finish the sentence. Victoria supplied it for him with a smile sharp as broken glass. "Settle down. We heard you were working as a teacher somewhere." "How noble." The word dripped with the kind of condescension that came from people who had never worked for anything meaningful in their lives. Before Sarah could respond, Rebecca appeared in the doorway behind them, and the temperature seemed to drop another 10 degrees. At 42, Rebecca had perfected the art of looking elegant while radiating hostility. Her black Chanel suit probably cost more than Sarah's monthly salary, and her jewelry caught the afternoon light like fragments of captured stars. She had always been the more dangerous of James' biological children, because her cruelty came wrapped in sophisticated packaging. "The lost little lamb returns," Rebecca said, her voice honey-sweet with poison underneath. "And she brought her own lamb, how precious." Her gaze fixed on Tommy with the kind of calculating assessment that made Sarah's protective instincts flare. Nobody looked at her son that way. Especially not people who had spent years making her feel worthless. Tommy shifted uncomfortably under Rebecca's scrutiny but didn't back down. He had learned early in life that showing weakness to predators only made them.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Hungrier. Margaret Chen appeared behind the siblings like a referee stepping between prize fighters. As the family's attorney for over 30 years, she had witnessed decades of Hartwell family dynamics and clearly recognized the potential for disaster. Her professional smile was warm but firm as she gestured toward the front door. "Why don't we all move inside? The other family members are already gathered in the study, and we have quite a bit to cover this afternoon." Her tone brooked no argument, and even David and Rebecca stepped aside to let her take control of the situation. The inside of the house felt like a museum dedicated to James Hartwell's success. Every surface displayed evidence of his rise from poor immigrant son to construction magnate. Awards lined the walls, photographs showed him shaking hands with governors and mayors, and expensive art pieces demonstrated his refined taste. But Sarah noticed things that others missed. The family photographs that lined the mantelpiece included David and Rebecca at every stage of their lives, but contained only a handful of pictures that included her, and those were clearly formal obligations rather than cherished memories. Tommy walked beside her, his eyes taking in everything with the sharp attention of a teenager trying to piece together his mother's mysterious past. Sarah could practically hear the questions forming in his mind, but he remained silent, sensing that this wasn't the time for curiosity. They were walking through a minefield of family history, and one wrong step could trigger explosions that would damage more than just pride. The study smelled of leather and old money, with built-in bookcases reaching from floor to ceiling and a massive oak desk that had been James's command center for 40 years. Extended family members filled the chairs and sofas, a collection of cousins and in-laws who had gathered like vultures to see what pieces of the Hartwell fortune they might claim. Their conversations died as Sarah entered the room, replaced by the kind of whispered speculation that followed scandal and surprise. Sarah recognized most of the faces from Christmas gatherings and birthday parties she had attended during her 11 years with the family. Aunt Eleanor, James's sister who had always treated Sarah with polite distance. Cousin Michael who had borrowed money from James twice and never paid it back. Uncle Robert and his wife Patricia, whose own construction company had folded 5 years earlier. They all looked at her with mixtures of surprise and calculation, wondering what she was doing there and whether her presence somehow threatened their own expectations. Margaret Chen took her position behind James's desk, a thick folder of legal documents spread before her like a battle plan. She was a small woman in her 60s, but her presence commanded the room with the authority that came from 40 years of navigating complex family disputes. Sarah had always liked Margaret, who had been one of the few adults in her childhood to treat her with genuine respect rather than charitable tolerance. "Before we begin," Margaret said, her voice carrying easily across the suddenly quiet room, "I want to remind everyone that James Hartwell was of sound mind when these documents were prepared. He made his wishes very clear, and while some of you may be surprised by certain provisions, everything was executed according to his explicit instructions." Her eyes swept the room, taking in each face with the careful attention of someone who anticipated conflict. David leaned back in his chair with the confidence of someone who had never been denied anything he wanted. "I'm sure Dad was very thorough," he said, his tone suggesting that thoroughness in this case meant ensuring his own continued comfort. "The company has been essentially mine for the past 5 years anyway, and Rebecca has been handling all the social obligations. This is really just a formality." His casual dismissal of the legal proceedings revealed how certain he was of the outcome. Rebecca nodded in agreement, her manicured fingers drumming against her purse with barely contained excitement. "The house will need some updating, of course. That wallpaper in the master bedroom is absolutely hideous, and the kitchen hasn't been renovated since the 80s. But Victoria and I have already discussed some wonderful ideas." Her presumptuous planning made it clear that she had already divided the estate in her mind, with Sarah receiving nothing more than a polite dismissal. Tommy glanced at his mother, whose face had gone carefully blank in the way it did when she was working hard to control her emotions. He had seen that expression before, usually when bill collectors called or when her car broke down and she had to figure out how to afford repairs. It was the look of someone who had learned to expect disappointment, but refused to let it show. His 16-year-old sense of justice flared at the casual cruelty being displayed toward the woman who had sacrificed everything to give him a good life. Margaret opened the folder and withdrew a sealed envelope, her movements deliberate and official. "James asked me to begin with a video message he recorded last month. He felt it was important for everyone to understand his reasoning before we proceed with the formal reading." She pressed a button on a small device, and a wall-mounted screen flickered to life, revealing James Hartwell and what would be his final recorded message to his family. He looked older than Sarah remembered, his once powerful frame diminished by the cancer that had ultimately claimed him. But his eyes still held the intelligence and determination that had built an empire from nothing. He sat in the same chair where he had lectured Sarah about responsibility and family duty 15 years earlier, but now his expression held something she had never seen before. "Regret. If you're watching this," James began, his voice weaker than the booming baritone Sarah remembered from her childhood, "then I'm gone, and it's time for some truths that should have been spoken years ago." He paused, his gaze seeming to look directly at each person in the room. "I made mistakes. Big ones. And the biggest mistake I made was letting fear and pride blind me to what really mattered. The room had gone completely silent, the kind of deep quiet that preceded revelations no one was prepared to hear. Sarah felt her heart racing as she watched the man who had shaped her childhood prepare to explain decisions that had haunted both of them for 15 years. Beside her, Tommy sat motionless, instinctively understanding that whatever came next would change everything they thought they knew about their family's story. James shifted in his chair on the screen, his weathered hands gripping the armrests as if drawing strength from the familiar furniture. The camera captured every line etched by years of hard work and harder decisions, but more than that, it revealed something Sarah had never seen in him before. Vulnerability. The powerful patriarch who had commanded boardrooms and built an empire was preparing to expose his deepest regrets to the very people he had spent decades trying to control and protect. "Sarah," he said, looking directly into the camera with an intensity that made her feel as though he were speaking to her alone, "if you're watching this, it means you came back despite everything I put you through. That took courage I'm not sure I ever possessed." His voice carried the weight of 15 years of unspoken apologies, each word carefully chosen but heavy with emotion. "When you were 7 years old and walked into this house with that social worker, you changed everything about our family. Not because of who you were, but because of who you helped us become." Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. She remembered that day with crystalline clarity, the way James had knelt down to her eye level, and promised that this would be different from the other homes. She had been so small then, clutching a stuffed rabbit that had been her only constant companion through years of uncertainty. Margaret had been there too, handling the legal paperwork that would make Sarah a Hartwell in name if not in blood. The video continued as James rubbed his temples, a gesture Sarah recognized from countless family meetings where he had struggled with difficult decisions. "I want everyone in this room to understand something that I should have made clear decades ago. Sarah wasn't just a foster child we took in out of charity. She wasn't a temporary arrangement that somehow became permanent. From the moment those adoption papers were signed, she became my daughter in every legal sense of the word." David's confident posture shifted slightly in his chair, but his expression remained dismissive. "Of course, Dad," he said to the screen as if James could hear him. "We all knew she was adopted. That doesn't change anything about the family business or the estate planning we've discussed." His tone suggested that adoption was merely a technicality, a legal formality that had no bearing on real family relationships or inheritance rights. But James wasn't finished. On screen, he reached for a glass of water with slightly shaking hands, the cancer treatments having weakened him more than his pride had ever allowed him to show publicly. "What you don't understand, David, what none of you understand, is that adoption doesn't make someone less of a child. It makes them chosen. Sarah wasn't born into this family by accident of biology. I selected her. I went through months of evaluations and paperwork because I wanted her specifically to be my daughter." Rebecca shifted uncomfortably, her earlier smugness beginning to crack around the edges. "Daddy was sentimental about charity cases," she murmured to Victoria, but her voice lacked its usual conviction. "It doesn't change the fact that the business has been promised to David for years." She was clinging to assumptions that had guided her expectations for decades, unwilling to consider that her father's final wishes might not align with her own sense of entitlement. Tommy watched his mother's face carefully, noting the tears that were threatening to spill despite her efforts to maintain composure. He had never seen her cry, not when their car broke down on Christmas morning 3 years ago, not when she worked double shifts to pay for his school supplies, not even when the doctors thought he might have leukemia during a frightening month when he was 12. But this old man on the screen was breaking through defenses that Tommy hadn't even known his mother possessed. James continued his message, his voice growing stronger as he spoke about the past. "The other children never accepted Sarah completely. They treated her like a guest who had overstayed her welcome, someone who was borrowing their father's attention rather than deserving it in her own right. I should have corrected that immediately, should have made it clear that she belonged here just as much as they did. But I was building a business, traveling constantly, and I told myself that children sort these things out naturally. The extended family members who had gathered for what they assumed would be a straightforward distribution of wealth were now exchanging uncertain glances. Cousin Michael whispered something to his wife about not remembering the adoption being such a formal process. Aunt Eleanor frowned as she tried to recall exactly what legal steps had been taken 30 years ago when Sarah first arrived. The comfortable assumptions that had shaped their understanding of family hierarchy were beginning to shift beneath their feet. Margaret Chen watched the room's dynamics with professional interest, her experienced eye cataloging each reaction for potential challenges to come. She had overseen the original adoption proceedings and remembered them well. James had been unusually thorough in his legal requirements, insisting on full adoption rather than guardianship or foster care arrangements. At the time, she had assumed it was simply his methodical nature applied to family matters. Now she understood it had been much more intentional. On screen, James paused to collect his thoughts before addressing what everyone could sense was the heart of his message. When Sarah turned 18 and fell in love with that boy from Hartford, I made the worst mistake of my parenting life. I tried to control her future the same way I controlled business deals and construction projects. When she chose love over my arranged plans, I gave her an ultimatum that I regret every day since. Sarah closed her eyes, remembering that horrible night when everything had changed. She had been accepted to college with a partial scholarship, planning to study education while maintaining her relationship with Miguel, a kind young man who worked at his family's restaurant and treated her with the respect she had never received from wealthy suitors. James had forbidden the relationship and demanded she accept an engagement to the son of a business partner, a merger disguised as marriage. When she refused, he had exploded with a fury that still echoed in her nightmares. I told her that if she walked out that door, she was no longer my daughter. James admitted to the camera, his voice breaking slightly on the words. I said she was throwing away everything I had given her for some boy who would never be able to provide for her properly. I was so concerned with protecting the family name and business connections that I forgot to protect the most important thing of all: my relationship with my daughter. Victoria whispered something sharp to David about not letting sentiment override practical considerations, but her husband was now paying closer attention to his father's words. Something in James's tone suggested this wasn't just a guilty confession but a prelude to consequences that none of them had anticipated. The comfortable certainty that had carried David through decades of assuming his inheritance was becoming less stable with each revelation. James reached off camera and retrieved a folder that he placed on his lap, his movements deliberate and meaningful. What I discovered later, what I should have asked at the time, was why Sarah was so determined to leave. I assumed it was teenage rebellion or infatuation with someone inappropriate for our social circle. I never bothered to find out that the boy she loved was actually working 2 jobs to help support his younger siblings while maintaining honor roll grades. I never learned that she had been volunteering at the children's hospital every weekend, using skills and compassion that I had failed to nurture at home. Tommy felt a surge of pride hearing about his mother's character being recognized, even if it had taken decades for the acknowledgement to come. He had grown up hearing stories about Miguel, the father he had never met who had died in a construction accident when Tommy was 2 years old. Sarah had always spoken about Miguel with love and respect, describing him as someone who had seen her true worth when others only saw her utility. I spent 15 years convincing myself that I had done the right thing. James continued, his fingers tracing the edges of the folder on his lap. I told myself that Sarah had made her choice and would have to live with the consequences. I buried myself deeper in work, traveled more frequently, and ignored the empty feeling that grew larger every year. David and Rebecca seemed content to take over family responsibilities, and I let them because it was easier than admitting I had been wrong. Rebecca was no longer hiding her irritation. "This is getting ridiculous," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Daddy always got emotional about his charity projects.
Sarah was well provided for while she lived here, and she chose to leave. We shouldn't have to sit through this guilt trip when we all know what the will says. Her words carried the sharp edge of someone whose patience was wearing thin, and whose certainty was being challenged by inconvenient truths. But Margaret Chen raised a hand for silence, her expression indicating that interrupting the video would not be tolerated. This message was specifically requested by your father to be played in its entirety before any legal documents are discussed. Please respect his final wishes. Her authoritative tone brooked no argument, and even Rebecca settled back into sullen silence, though her foot tapped impatiently against the Persian rug. James seemed to anticipate the restlessness of his audience because his next words carried renewed energy and purpose. 3 years ago, I received a phone call that changed everything I thought I knew about the daughter I had rejected. The call came from Hartford General Hospital, where I was told that someone had been making anonymous donations to cover medical treatments for cancer patients who couldn't afford their care. The donations were substantial and had been coming regularly for over a decade. Sarah felt her blood turn cold. She had never told anyone about the donations, had carefully arranged them through different channels to ensure they could never be traced back to her. The money had come from second jobs, tutoring sessions, and selling crafts at weekend markets. It had meant eating ramen noodles for weeks at a time and buying clothes from thrift stores, but she had witnessed too much suffering during her volunteer work to ignore families who were facing financial devastation alongside medical trauma. The hospital's development director was calling because they wanted to properly thank their anonymous benefactor, and their investigation had finally traced the donations back to someone connected to our family. They thought it might be me or one of my children making donations in memory of my late wife. James's voice grew softer as he mentioned his first wife, David, and Rebecca's mother, who had died when they were teenagers. When they described the donation pattern and the specific programs being supported, I realized it could only be Sarah. Tommy stared at his mother with new understanding. All those times she had claimed to be working late or attending teacher conferences, she had actually been at the hospital. All those careful budgets and second-hand purchases had been because she was giving away money they could barely afford to spare. The sacrifices that had shaped his entire childhood suddenly took on a different meaning, revealing a depth of character that made him proud and heartbroken simultaneously. David was no longer lounging casually in his chair. "The hospital donations were from Sarah?" he asked, his voice carrying the first note of uncertainty he had shown since their arrival. But how could she afford that kind of generosity on a teacher's salary? The question revealed more than he had intended about his assumptions regarding Sarah's circumstances and capabilities. James smiled sadly at the camera. "That was exactly what I wondered, so I did something I should have done 15 years earlier. I investigated. I learned that Sarah had not only become an exceptional elementary school teacher, but had also earned a master's degree in education while raising her son alone. I learned that she volunteered at 3 different charities, served on the Parent-Teacher Association board, and had been named Hartford's Teacher of the Year twice." The room had gone completely quiet now, the earlier whispered conversations and dismissive comments replaced by an attention that bordered on mesmerized. Even the extended family members who had barely known Sarah during her childhood were beginning to understand that this wasn't just a guilty father's sentimental rambling, but a revelation that might have serious implications for their own expectations. "I also learned," James continued, his voice taking on a tone of deep regret, "that Sarah had been sending money to help with my medical expenses. Small amounts, always anonymous, always carefully disguised as coming from different sources. She had been taking care of the father who had rejected her, even while struggling to provide for her own child." His eyes filled with tears that he didn't try to hide. "She never stopped being my daughter, even when I stopped being her father." Sarah felt the room's attention shift
toward her like a physical weight. Every pair of eyes seemed to be reassessing her, calculating the implications of her secret generosity and what it might mean for their own financial expectations. She had never wanted credit for the donations or the medical payments. The money had been sent out of love and obligation, not as some kind of investment in future inheritance rights. Margaret Chen watched Sarah's reaction carefully, remembering the young woman who had signed legal documents decades earlier with the same quiet dignity she was displaying now. The lawyer had seen many family dynamics over her career, but the Hartwell situation had always struck her as particularly tragic because it was so unnecessary. James had possessed both the power and the resources to maintain his relationship with Sarah, but pride and stubbornness had prevented him from taking the steps that could have avoided 15 years of separation. James shifted forward in his chair, bringing himself closer to the camera with an intensity that demanded attention. I want everyone in this room to understand that what I'm about to tell you isn't the rambling of a guilty conscience or the sentimental wishes of a dying man. This is the correction of a fundamental injustice that I allowed to persist for far too long. He paused, ensuring his words would carry maximum impact. Sarah Martinez Mitchell is not just an adopted daughter who deserves my affection and gratitude. She is legally and morally my equal heir to everything I have built. The implications of his words hung in the air like storm clouds gathering before a hurricane. David's face had gone pale, while Rebecca gripped the arms of her chair with white knuckles. The extended family members exchanged glances that ranged from confusion to calculating interest, each person trying to determine how this revelation might affect their own modest expectations from the estate. Victoria was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. Equal heir, but surely that doesn't mean equal inheritance. Sarah left the family 15 years ago. She chose to give up her claim when she walked away from the business and the family name. Her words carried the desperate edge of someone whose comfortable future was suddenly being threatened by inconvenient legal realities. But James had anticipated this argument. Sarah never gave up her claim because she never legally could give it up. Adoption creates the same legal rights as biological birth. The family business, the real estate holdings, the investment accounts, all of it belongs as much to Sarah as it does to David and Rebecca. The only difference is that she has spent 15 years proving she deserved it, while they have spent 15 years assuming they were entitled to it. Tommy watched his mother struggle to process what she was hearing. He could see her methodical mind working through the implications, trying to understand how her life had suddenly shifted from financial uncertainty to potential wealth beyond anything she had ever imagined. But more than the money, he could see her grappling with the emotional impact of finally receiving the acknowledgement and acceptance she had craved since childhood. The video message was approaching its conclusion, but James had one more revelation that would reshape everything the family thought they knew about inheritance and justice. He lifted the folder from his lap and held it toward the camera, its contents still hidden but its importance clear from his reverent handling of the documents inside. In this folder, James said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of hidden truth, are the original adoption papers that made Sarah my daughter. But more importantly, it contains amendments to those papers that I filed 5 years ago, amendments that none of you knew about because I wanted to see how each of you would treat Sarah when you thought she had no legal claim to protect her. Margaret Chen nodded slightly, confirming the existence of legal documents that would soon reshape the entire family's understanding of their financial future. She had been waiting for this moment, knowing that James's carefully orchestrated plan was about to reveal not just his final wishes, but his ultimate judgment on the character and worthiness of each family member who had gathered to claim their share of his legacy. James opened the folder on screen with deliberate care, each movement calculated to build suspense and emphasize the gravity of what he was about to reveal. The papers inside were clearly legal documents, their official seals and formal typing visible even through the camera's resolution. But there was something else in the folder, something that made James handle the contents with the reverence usually reserved for sacred artifacts or family heirlooms of immeasurable value. These amendments, James continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades making decisions that affected hundreds of employees and millions of dollars, were filed with the Connecticut Probate Court 5 years ago. They establish not only Sarah's equal legal standing as my heir, but also specify conditions under which inheritance rights would be determined. His weathered hands trembled slightly as he withdrew a document that would clearly reshape everything his surviving family members believed about their financial futures. David leaned forward in his chair, his earlier casual confidence now replaced by sharp attention to details that could affect his ability to maintain the lifestyle he had enjoyed for decades. "Conditions?" he asked the screen, his voice tight with barely controlled anxiety. "What kind of conditions?" "The business has been operating under the assumption that I would inherit controlling interest. We've made commitments, signed contracts, planned expansions based on that understanding." But James's recorded image couldn't respond to David's growing panic, and the video continued with the inexorable pace of a man who had carefully planned every word for maximum impact. "I realized 5 years ago that I had failed as a father not just to Sarah, but to all of my children. I had given David and Rebecca everything they wanted without requiring them to earn it, while I had given Sarah nothing despite her consistently proving she deserved it." Rebecca's composure finally cracked completely. "This is insane," she said, her voice rising to a pitch that bordered on hysteria. "Daddy promised me the house. We've been planning renovations for months. I've already spoken with contractors about updating the kitchen and master suite. You can't just change everything because you feel guilty about some adopted girl who left the family voluntarily." Margaret Chen's expression remained professionally neutral, but Sarah could see the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested the lawyer was mentally preparing for the legal challenges that would inevitably follow this revelation. Family inheritance disputes were among the most emotionally charged and potentially destructive cases in law, especially when they involved significant assets and long-held assumptions about family hierarchy. Tommy found himself studying the faces around the room with the fascination of someone watching a nature documentary about predators, suddenly realizing their prey might actually be the apex predator. The adults who had dismissed his mother with such casual cruelty were now scrambling to understand how their own financial security might be threatened by someone they had considered irrelevant to their futures. James continued his message with the methodical precision of someone who had spent his career explaining complex situations to skeptical investors and demanding clients. "The conditions I established are simple but comprehensive. Each potential heir would be evaluated based on 3 criteria. First, their treatment of family members, particularly those they perceived as having less power or status. Second, their contribution to the family business and community welfare. Third, their demonstration of the values that built this family's success." Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she began to understand the scope of what James had orchestrated. This wasn't just a will reading, it was a judgment day where 15 years of behavior would determine financial futures. She thought about all the small kindnesses she had shown to hospital staff, the extra hours she had spent helping struggling students, the anonymous donations that had stretched her budget but helped families in crisis. The extended family members were now whispering frantically among themselves, each person mentally reviewing their own actions over the past several years, and wondering how those actions might be interpreted by a man who had apparently been observing and evaluating them without their knowledge. Cousin Michael looked particularly uncomfortable as he remembered the loan he had never repaid, and his frequent complaints about James being too controlling with family money. "Over the past 5 years," James explained, his voice taking on the tone of a prosecutor presenting evidence to a jury, "I hired private investigators to document how each of my children treated others when they thought their actions wouldn't affect their inheritance. I wanted to see who they really were when they believed their financial futures were secure, and their behavior wouldn't have consequences." Victoria grabbed David's arm with enough force to leave marks, her carefully maintained composure dissolving into raw panic. "Investigators. He was having us watched. That's a violation of privacy. Surely that can't be legal evidence for inheritance decisions." Her voice carried the shrill desperation of someone realizing that years of careless cruelty might now carry devastating financial consequences. Margaret Chen cleared her throat softly, drawing attention back to her position behind James's desk. I can assure you that all investigations were conducted within legal boundaries, and that the documentation gathered is entirely admissible for inheritance determination purposes. Mr. Hartwell was very thorough in ensuring that his final wishes could not be challenged on procedural grounds. On the screen, James reached into the folder and withdrew a thick stack of photographs and documents, holding them up for the camera to capture. What the investigators found confirmed everything I had suspected but been too proud to acknowledge. Sarah had been living a life that exemplified every value I had tried to instill in my children, while David and Rebecca had been living lives that contradicted those values at every opportunity. The first photograph James held up showed Sarah at Hartford General Hospital, wearing scrubs and reading to a young patient who was clearly undergoing chemotherapy treatment. Her face in the image radiated the kind of genuine compassion that couldn't be faked or performed for cameras. Tommy recognized the scene because he had sometimes accompanied his mother to the hospital and had seen how children's faces lit up when she entered their rooms with books and games and unlimited patience for their fears and questions. This photograph was taken 18 months ago, James explained, his voice filled with pride that he had been unable to express during his lifetime. Sarah was volunteering in the pediatric oncology ward during her spring break from teaching. She spent her vacation time comforting sick children and supporting their families through the worst experiences of their lives. She did this while working 2 jobs and raising her own son, never seeking recognition or reward. The next photograph showed Sarah at a Hartford food bank, organizing donations and serving meals to homeless families. She was laughing at something a young boy had said, her genuine joy in helping others evident even in a candid shot taken from across the room. Sarah remembered that day clearly because Tommy had helped her sort canned goods and had asked thoughtful questions about why some families didn't have enough to eat. This was taken 3 months ago, James continued. Sarah organizes the monthly community service project for her school district, bringing together teachers and students to address local needs. She started this program 5 years ago and has personally coordinated assistance for over 200 families in crisis. All of this was done quietly, without publicity or credit, simply because she believed it was the right thing to do. David was staring at the photographs with an expression that mixed disbelief with growing dread. He had assumed that Sarah's life since leaving the family had been one of struggle and regret, that her departure from wealth and status had been a mistake she was too proud to admit. The evidence of her meaningful, generous life was forcing him to confront the possibility that she had actually made the better choice when she walked away from the Hartwell name and expectations. James set the photographs aside and picked up a different set of documents, these clearly bearing official letterheads and formal signatures. These are letters from the organizations Sarah has served, documenting her contributions and impact. The Hartford School District credits her with developing programs that have improved literacy rates in low-income neighborhoods by 30%. The hospital where she volunteers estimates that her work has provided over 5,000 hours of unpaid patient support. Rebecca was no longer trying to maintain her sophisticated composure, so she volunteers and teaches school children. That doesn't mean she should inherit a construction empire worth millions of dollars. She has no business experience, no understanding of corporate operations, no connections in the industry. Giving her control of the company would destroy everything Daddy built. But James had anticipated this argument as well. Business experience and corporate connections aren't inherited traits, Rebecca. They're learned skills that can be developed by anyone with sufficient intelligence and motivation. More importantly, they're meaningless without the character to use them responsibly and the integrity to put employee welfare and community benefit ahead of personal profit. The camera angle shifted slightly as James leaned forward, bringing his face closer to the lens with an intensity that made everyone in the room feel as though they were receiving individual judgment. What the investigators discovered about David and Rebecca's behavior over the past 5 years has been deeply disappointing but not entirely surprising.
They documented patterns of entitlement, cruelty, and selfishness that would make any parent question whether those children deserved to inherit the results of a lifetime's work. Tommy watched his mother's face as she processed the implications of what she was hearing. Her expression was carefully controlled, but he could see the internal struggle between hope and disbelief, between the lifetime of rejection she had experienced and the possibility that justice might finally be served. He wanted to take her hand and tell her that she deserved whatever recognition was coming, but the atmosphere in the room was too charged for casual gestures of support. James withdrew another set of photographs from his folder, these clearly showing David and Rebecca in various social situations. These images were taken at charity events where David and Rebecca represented the family name and business interests. Watch carefully how they interact with service staff, with people they perceive as beneath their social status, with anyone who couldn't potentially benefit their careers or social standing. The first photograph showed David at an elegant fundraiser, dismissing a waiter who had accidentally spilled wine on his sleeve. Even in a still image, his expression of contempt and superiority was unmistakable. The waiter's face showed the kind of resigned humiliation that came from being treated as invisible by people who considered themselves inherently superior. This waiter, James explained, is a college student working 3 jobs to support his disabled mother. David not only berated him publicly for an accident, but also demanded he be fired from the catering company. When the young man tried to apologize and explain that he would pay for the dry cleaning, David told him that people like him shouldn't be allowed at events for real people. Sarah flinched at the casual cruelty documented in the photograph. She remembered being on the receiving end of similar treatment during her teenage years when David and Rebecca's friends visited the house. They had perfected the art of making her feel worthless while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions, always able to claim they were just joking or that she was being too sensitive. The next photograph showed Rebecca at a country club luncheon, her face twisted in obvious disdain as she spoke to someone outside the camera's view. Her body language radiated the kind of dismissive superiority that made it clear she considered herself inherently better than whoever she was addressing. Rebecca was speaking to Maria Gonzalez, who has been cleaning the country club for 12 years, James explained, his voice heavy with disappointment. Maria's daughter had just been accepted to nursing school, and she was sharing her excitement with the club members she has served faithfully for over a decade. Rebecca told her that it was inappropriate for staff to bother members with personal news and suggested that Maria should focus on doing her job properly instead of daydreaming about her family's advancement. Margaret Chen watched the room's dynamics shift as the documented evidence of David and Rebecca's character flaws was presented with devastating clarity. She had seen many inheritance disputes over her career, but few had been orchestrated with such methodical precision or moral purpose. James had essentially created a trial where the evidence was uncontestable, and the verdict would be delivered through legal documents that couldn't be argued or appealed. Victoria was now openly crying, mascara streaking down her cheeks as she realized that years of social climbing and careful positioning were about to be destroyed by her husband's inability to treat service workers with basic human dignity. "David isn't cruel," she said desperately. "He's just particular about service standards. That's not the same as being a bad person. Surely that can't justify destroying his inheritance rights," but James wasn't finished presenting evidence. The investigators documented dozens of similar incidents over 5 years. David treating restaurant servers like personal servants, Rebecca mocking charity volunteers who didn't meet her standards of sophistication, both of them consistently demonstrating that they viewed wealth as permission to treat others with contempt rather than as responsibility to lift others up. Tommy found himself thinking about all the service workers his mother had taught him to acknowledge and thank. She had always insisted that he make eye contact with cashiers, say please and thank you to custodians, and remember that every job had dignity regardless of its social status. Watching the evidence of David and Rebecca's casual cruelty, he understood why his mother had been so insistent about basic respect and courtesy. The photographs continued, each one documenting another instance of callousness or entitlement. David demanding that a parking valet retrieve his car immediately despite a long line of other customers waiting. Rebecca complaining loudly about the quality of service at a charity dinner where volunteers were donating their time to serve meals to homeless families. Both siblings consistently treating anyone in a service position as less than fully human. "What disturbs me most," James said, his voice carrying the weight of profound disappointment, "is not just the cruelty itself but the casual nature of David and Rebecca treat service workers, charitable volunteers, and anyone they perceive as socially inferior with automatic contempt. This isn't occasional bad behavior, it's a fundamental character flaw that reveals how they view their place in the world." Sarah thought about her own experiences with service workers since leaving the Hartwell family. She had been a waitress, a retail clerk, a substitute teacher working for daily wages. She had experienced firsthand the kind of treatment that David and Rebecca routinely inflicted on others, and she had vowed to never make anyone else feel the invisible humiliation that came from being dismissed as unimportant. James set the photographs aside and reached for the final document in his folder, this one clearly different from the others. It was handwritten rather than typed, and even through the camera, it was obvious that the writing was James's own careful script. "This is my final letter to each of my children, explaining my decision and the reasoning behind the inheritance distribution that Margaret will now read to you." The room fell silent with the kind of absolute quiet that preceded life-changing revelations. Even the extended family members who had been whispering among themselves throughout the video presentation now focused their complete attention on James's final message. Everyone understood that the next few minutes would determine financial futures and family relationships for generations to come. To David and Rebecca, James began reading from his handwritten letter, "I want you to understand that this decision isn't punishment but consequence. You have spent your adult lives believing that wealth exempts you from treating others with basic human decency. You have used your privileged positions to diminish others rather than elevate them. You have demonstrated that you view inheritance not as responsibility but as entitlement." David stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger and desperation. "This is ridiculous. We're supposed to lose our inheritance because some investigators took photographs out of context. Everyone has bad days, everyone gets frustrated with poor service. That doesn't mean we're terrible people who don't deserve what we've been promised our entire lives." But Margaret Chen gestured for him to sit down, her expression making it clear that interrupting the video would not change its content or legal implications. David remained standing for a moment longer, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, before slowly sinking back into his chair with the defeated posture of someone realizing that their comfortable assumptions about the future were crumbling beyond repair. James continued reading his letter with the steady voice of someone who had made peace with difficult but necessary decisions. "I have spent 5 years hoping that you would demonstrate growth, compassion, or recognition that your behavior needed to change. Instead, the evidence shows that your treatment of others has actually worsened as you've become more secure in your expected inheritance. You have failed the most basic test of character, which is how you treat people who have no power to help or hurt you." The final paragraph of James's letter was addressed directly to Sarah, and his voice changed completely as he read it, softening with genuine love and respect that had been absent during her childhood, but had apparently developed during their years of separation. "To Sarah, my daughter, who chose integrity over comfort and service over status, I want you to know that watching you build a meaningful life has been my greatest pride and deepest regret. Pride in who you became, regret that I wasn't wise enough to recognize your worth when you needed my support most." Sarah felt tears spilling down her cheeks despite her efforts to maintain composure in front of the hostile audience that surrounded her. The acknowledgement she had craved since childhood was finally being offered, but it was coming 15 years too late and from beyond the grave. The timing felt simultaneously like vindication and tragedy, justice served but at the cost of any chance for reconciliation or relationship repair. James folded his letter carefully before looking directly into the camera one final time. "Margaret Chen will now read the specific terms of my last will and testament. I ask each of you to remember that these decisions were made after careful consideration of your actions, your character, and your worthiness to carry forward the values that built our family's success. Some of you may be surprised by what you receive, others may be disappointed. But all of you will receive exactly what you have earned. The video screen went dark, leaving the room in a silence so complete that Sarah could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Margaret Chen allowed the quiet to stretch for several long moments, giving everyone time to absorb the full implications of what they had just witnessed, before opening the legal folder that contained James Hartwell's final judgments and their binding legal consequences. Margaret Chen opened the official will document with the same ceremonial gravity that had marked every aspect of this carefully orchestrated revelation. The papers were bound in leather and sealed with wax, giving them the weight and importance of a historical treaty rather than a simple estate distribution. Her fingers traced the embossed letterhead as she prepared to read words that would reshape the financial landscape of everyone present and determine the fate of a construction empire built over 4 decades of relentless work and strategic planning. I, James William Hartwell, being of sound mind and body, do hereby establish this as my final last will and testament, superseding all previous versions and codicils. Margaret began, her voice carrying the authority of legal tradition and binding consequence. This document was prepared with full knowledge of Connecticut inheritance law, and with specific attention to the unique circumstances surrounding my family structure and the adoption of Sarah Elena Martinez, now legally Sarah Elena Mitchell. The formal language seemed to amplify the tension in the room, each legal phrase carrying implications that extended far beyond simple monetary distribution. Sarah felt her breathing become shallow as she realized that her entire future and Tommy's educational opportunities hung in the balance of words that had been written months earlier by a man who had rejected her, but apparently never stopped considering her his daughter. David's leg bounced nervously beneath the mahogany coffee table, a nervous habit from childhood that resurfaced whenever he felt his control over situations slipping away. He had spent 15 years assuming that Sarah's departure from the family meant her automatic exclusion from any inheritance considerations, and the possibility that his assumption might be legally incorrect was threatening to destroy everything he had planned for his own future and his children's security. Rebecca sat rigidly in her chair, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles had turned white beneath her expensive manicure. She was mentally calculating how much of her lifestyle depended on the inheritance she had considered guaranteed, how many financial commitments she had made based on expectations that were now being challenged by legal documents and moral judgments she had never anticipated. Margaret continued with the reading, her professional composure masking what Sarah suspected was personal satisfaction at seeing justice finally served to a young woman who had been mistreated by people who should have protected and
cherished her. To my son David James Hartwell, I leave the sum of $50,000, my collection of vintage construction equipment, and my personal library of business and leadership books, with the hope that he will use these resources to develop the character and wisdom he has thus far failed to demonstrate. The words hit David like physical blows, each phrase destroying another piece of the comfortable future he had assumed was his by right of birth and gender. $50,000 was a substantial sum for most people, but it represented less than 1% of his father's total estate, a symbolic gesture that felt more like punishment than inheritance. His mouth opened and closed silently as he struggled to process the magnitude of what he was losing. Victoria's carefully controlled facade cracked completely as the implications of David's minimal inheritance became clear. Their lifestyle, their children's private school tuition, their country club membership, their vacation home in the Hamptons, all of it depended on David inheriting the family business and the millions of dollars in assets that came with it. "There has to be some mistake," she whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. "David has been managing the company operations for years. He knows every aspect of the business." But Margaret continued reading without pause, her voice steady and implacable as she delivered news that would fundamentally alter the lives of everyone present. "To my daughter Rebecca Ann Hartwell Stone, I leave the sum of $50,000, my late wife's jewelry collection, and the family photographs spanning 4 generations, with the hope that she will learn to value relationships over material possessions and find meaning beyond social status and superficial achievements. Rebecca's composure shattered like crystal hitting concrete. $50,000, she repeated, her voice rising to near hysteria. That's impossible. Daddy promised me the house. We've been planning to move in after the renovations. I've already hired decorators and contractors. You can't just change everything because of some sentimental nonsense about adopted children and charity work. Tommy watched the adult meltdowns with the fascination of someone observing a nature documentary about apex predators, suddenly discovering they were actually prey animals. The people who had treated his mother with such casual cruelty just hours earlier were now experiencing the same kind of powerlessness and dismissal they had routinely inflicted on others throughout their privileged lives. Margaret's expression remained professionally neutral, but there was something in her eyes that suggested decades of witnessing family dynamics had given her particular satisfaction in delivering justice to those who had abused their positions of power and privilege. She had been present for Sarah's adoption proceedings 30 years earlier and had watched a vulnerable child transform into a woman of exceptional character despite receiving little support from the family that should have nurtured her growth. The remainder of my estate, Margaret continued, her voice growing stronger as she approached the climactic revelation that everyone had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure, including all real estate holdings, the complete ownership of Hartwell Construction Company, all investment accounts, retirement funds, and personal property not specifically mentioned above. I leave entirely and without restriction to my daughter Sarah Elena Mitchell, with complete confidence that she will use these resources responsibly and with the same integrity she has demonstrated throughout her adult life. The silence that followed was so profound it seemed to absorb sound rather than simply represent its absence. Sarah felt the room spin slightly as the magnitude of what she had just inherited settled into her consciousness. She was now the sole owner of a construction company worth millions, the proprietor of multiple real estate holdings, and the beneficiary of investment accounts that would ensure financial security for generations of her family. David shot to his feet with explosive force, his chair toppling backward as he struggled to comprehend the complete reversal of everything he had believed about his future. "This is insane," he shouted, his voice echoing off the study's wood-paneled walls. "She can't inherit everything, she's been gone for 15 years. She knows nothing about construction or business management, she'll destroy everything Dad built within a year." But Margaret was not finished reading. "Additionally, I have established a trust fund for Sarah's son Tommy Mitchell, in the amount of $200,000, to be used exclusively for his educational expenses through graduate school, with the understanding that education is the foundation of both personal success and social responsibility." Tommy felt his mother's hand squeeze his with trembling intensity as she struggled to process the life-changing implications of what was happening. He had grown up expecting to work part-time jobs through college and graduate with substantial student loan debt, accepting that financial limitation as a natural consequence of their modest circumstances. The sudden promise of educational freedom felt almost too overwhelming to accept as reality. Victoria collapsed back into her chair as if her strings had been cut, the full weight of their financial disaster finally penetrating her shock. "We'll challenge it," she said desperately. "There's no way this can be legal." James wasn't thinking clearly at the end. The cancer treatments affected his judgment. No court would uphold a will that gives everything to an adopted daughter while leaving the biological children practically nothing. Margaret Chen set down the will document and reached for a second folder that had been waiting beside the first, this one containing the legal ammunition that James had prepared to defend his decisions against exactly the kind of challenges that Victoria was already threatening. Mr. Hartwell anticipated that his inheritance decisions might be contested, so he prepared comprehensive documentation to support the validity of his choices and his mental competency at the time of their execution. She opened the second folder to reveal psychiatric evaluations, medical records, and legal affidavits that would make challenging the will virtually impossible. These documents include independent psychological evaluations confirming Mr. Hartwell's sound mental state, medical records showing that his cancer treatments did not affect his cognitive function, and sworn statements from multiple witnesses attesting to his clear intention and reasoning regarding the inheritance distribution. Sarah found her voice for the first time since the reading had begun, her words quiet but steady as she addressed the family that had rejected her but was now dependent on her generosity for their financial futures. I don't want anyone to think this was something I planned or expected. I came here to say goodbye, not to claim an inheritance. I had no idea James was even considering leaving me anything, much less everything. Rebecca laughed bitterly, her sophisticated mask completely discarded in favor of raw resentment and disbelief. Oh please, spare us the innocent act. You must have known something. All those anonymous donations to his medical care, all that volunteer work documented by investigators, it was all calculated to manipulate a dying man into changing his will. You played the long game perfectly, but Tommy's anger flared at hearing his mother accused of manipulation and calculated deception. At 16, he possessed both the moral clarity of youth and the protective instincts that came from watching his mother sacrifice constantly for others without seeking recognition or reward. My mom didn't even know about any investigations, he said, his voice carrying surprising authority for someone his age. She helped people because that's who she is, not because she wanted anything from anyone. Margaret reached for a third document, this one bearing the official seal of the Connecticut Probate Court and multiple legal signatures. There is one additional matter that Mr. Hartwell specifically requested I address during this reading. The question of Sarah's legal standing as an heir and her relationship to the family name has been raised several times today, so I want to clarify the legal realities for everyone present. She unfolded the document carefully, revealing what appeared to be an amended birth certificate alongside the original adoption papers that had been filed 30 years earlier. When Sarah was adopted by James and Maria Hartwell in 1994, the legal process was completed with full adoption rather than guardianship or foster care arrangements. This means that under Connecticut law, Sarah possesses identical inheritance rights to those of biological children. David was pacing now, his expensive suit wrinkled and his carefully styled hair disheveled as he struggled to find some legal or logical argument that might reverse the catastrophe that had befallen his expectations. But she left the family, he protested desperately. She rejected the Hartwell name when she married that guy. She can't claim family inheritance rights after abandoning her family obligations. Margaret's expression hardened as she prepared to deliver what would be the final blow to David and Rebecca's last hopes of reversing their father's decisions. Adoption creates permanent legal relationships that cannot be dissolved by marriage, geographic relocation, or temporary estrangement. Sarah's inheritance rights were never dependent on her maintaining residence in the family home or approval of her personal relationships, they were established by law the moment the adoption was finalized. She held up the amended birth certificate, its official seals and signatures clearly visible to everyone in the room. Hartwell filed additional paperwork 5 years ago that specifically reinforces Sarah's legal standing and addresses any potential challenges to her inheritance rights based on her adoption status or her departure from the family home. Sarah stared at the documents that legally established her identity and inheritance rights, feeling overwhelmed by the realization that James had spent years planning not just her vindication but her protection against exactly the kind of legal challenges that his biological children were already threatening to pursue. The careful preparation suggested a depth of consideration and care that she had never experienced during her childhood with the Hartwells. Rebecca made one last desperate attempt to find some angle that might preserve her expected inheritance. What about the business? Sarah doesn't know anything about construction or corporate management. Surely Dad wouldn't have wanted the company destroyed by someone with no experience in the industry. Maybe we could arrange some kind of partnership or management agreement. But Margaret was ready for this argument as well. Mr. Hartwell addressed the business succession question extensively in his planning documents.
He expressed complete confidence in Sarah's intelligence and integrity, noting that the most important qualifications for business leadership are moral character and sound judgment rather than industry-specific experience, which can be learned and developed over time. Tommy felt a surge of pride watching his mother handle the overwhelming situation with the same quiet dignity she had shown throughout his childhood when facing various crises and challenges. She wasn't gloating over her unexpected inheritance or being cruel to David and Rebecca despite their years of mistreatment. She was processing the magnitude of her new responsibilities with the same thoughtful seriousness she brought to every important decision. Margaret closed the legal folders and looked around the room at faces that reflected shock, devastation, resignation, and cautious hope. This concludes the formal reading of James Hartwell's last will and testament. The estate will proceed through probate as required by law, but given the comprehensive documentation and legal preparation involved, I don't anticipate any successful challenges to the inheritance distribution. The extended family members who had gathered expecting modest bequests from a distant relative were now quietly calculating how Sarah's unexpected elevation to family matriarch might affect their own relationships and future interactions with the Hartwell legacy. Some looked ashamed of their earlier dismissive treatment of her, while others seemed to be already planning how to position themselves favorably with the new power structure. David slumped in his chair, the fight draining out of him as the finality of the situation penetrated his shock and denial. His entire adult identity had been built around being James Hartwell's heir and successor, and without that role he would need to discover who he was beyond his expectations of inherited wealth and status. The prospect of reinventing himself at 45 was terrifying and humbling in ways he had never imagined possible. Victoria was staring into space with the hollow expression of someone whose comfortable assumptions about the future had been completely shattered. Their children's private school tuition, their mortgage payments, their vacation plans, all of it would need to be reconsidered and probably eliminated based on David's minimal inheritance and whatever income he could generate through his own efforts rather than family wealth. Rebecca had stopped crying but was still clutching her purse with white-knuckled intensity, as if holding on to her expensive accessories might somehow preserve her social status even as the financial foundation that supported it crumbled beneath her feet. The country club memberships, the charity board positions, the social connections that defined her identity were all built on inherited wealth that no longer existed. Sarah stood slowly, feeling the weight of new responsibilities settling onto her shoulders like an unfamiliar but not uncomfortable garment. She looked at Tommy, whose expression mixed pride in his mother with concern about how their lives were about to change, and she realized that her first priority would be ensuring that wealth didn't corrupt the values and character they had built together through years of modest living and careful choices. "I know this is difficult for everyone," Sarah said quietly, addressing the room but looking particularly at David and Rebecca, whose lives had just been fundamentally altered by their father's final judgment of their character. "I never wanted this to happen at anyone else's expense. I just wanted to say goodbye to someone who had been important in my life, despite our complicated history." David looked up at her with an expression that mixed resentment with something that might have been the beginning of respect or at least recognition of her graciousness and victory. "What are you going to do with the company?" he asked, his voice stripped of its earlier arrogance and authority. "It employs over 200 people, their jobs and families depend on the business staying successful." The question revealed that beneath his entitlement and cruelty, David did understand the broader implications of business ownership and the responsibilities that came with controlling other people's livelihoods. Sarah appreciated that his concern for the employees was genuine, even if it was motivated partly by his own anxiety about the changes that were coming to every aspect of the family's business operations. "I'm going to learn everything I can about the company and the industry," Sarah replied, her voice carrying the same determination that had gotten her through college while working multiple jobs and raising a child alone. "I'm going to talk to the employees, understand their concerns and needs, and make sure the business continues to provide good jobs and serve the community responsibly." That's what James would have wanted. Margaret began gathering the legal documents, her professional duties concluded but her personal interest in the outcome clearly satisfied by seeing justice served to someone who had demonstrated exceptional character despite receiving minimal support from those who should have nurtured her development. Sarah, you'll need to meet with the company's financial advisors and legal counsel within the next 2 weeks to begin the ownership transition process. I can arrange those meetings and provide you with all the documentation you'll need. Tommy stood beside his mother, still processing the magnitude of how their lives were about to change but confident that whatever came next they would face it together with the same values and mutual support that had carried them through years of financial uncertainty and social exclusion. The prospect of educational opportunities he had never dared imagine was exciting, but more than that he was proud of his mother's character being finally recognized and rewarded. The extended family members began filing out of the study, their conversations subdued as they adjusted their expectations and reconsidered their relationships with the new head of the Hartwell family. Some offered brief condolences to Sarah about James's death, while others simply left without acknowledgement, uncertain how to navigate the completely altered family dynamics. Victoria helped David to his feet, both of them moving with the careful deliberation of people who were still in shock but beginning to face the practical implications of their changed circumstances. They would need to have difficult conversations about lifestyle adjustments, career changes and financial planning based on dramatically reduced resources and expectations. Rebecca gathered her belongings with jerky mechanical movements, her social programming struggling to process the reversal of power dynamics that had defined her relationships for decades. The woman she had dismissed as irrelevant just hours earlier was now in a position to affect every aspect of the family's future, and the recognition of that reality was both humbling and terrifying. Sarah watched the biological children of James Hartwell struggle with the consequences of their father's final judgment, feeling a mixture of sympathy for their pain and satisfaction that justice had finally been served after 15 years of carrying the weight of undeserved rejection and social exile. The vindication felt both overwhelming and deeply healing, proof that character and integrity ultimately mattered more than social status or inherited privilege. As the study emptied, Sarah found herself alone with Tommy and Margaret, the three of them surrounded by the artifacts of James Hartwell's successful life and contemplating the responsibilities and opportunities that were now Sarah's to steward. The house that had never felt like home during her childhood was now legally hers, along with the power to decide whether it would become a place of warmth and inclusion or remain a monument to social exclusion and family hierarchy. Margaret smiled at Sarah with genuine warmth, her professional composure giving way to personal satisfaction at seeing a worthy person finally receive appropriate recognition and reward. James would be proud of how you've handled this entire situation. Your grace and dignity in the face of hostility shows exactly why he was right to trust you with his legacy. Sarah nodded, still struggling to fully accept the magnitude of what had happened but beginning to understand that her new wealth and status came with opportunities to help others in ways she had never been able to afford before. The anonymous donations to medical charities could now be expanded dramatically, the volunteer work at schools and hospitals could be supported with significant financial contributions, and the values that had guided her modest life could now be implemented on a much larger scale. Tommy looked around the study that would now be part of his inheritance, taking in the leather-bound books, expensive art, and symbols of power and success that represented a completely different world from the one where he had grown up. But more than the material wealth, he was processing the recognition that his mother's character had finally been acknowledged and rewarded by the family that had rejected both of them. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice carrying the practical concerns of someone who understood that great changes would require careful planning and thoughtful decision-making. "Do we move here? Do we keep our apartment in Hartford? How do we manage a construction company when neither of us knows anything about construction?" Sarah put her arm around her son's shoulders, drawing strength from his presence as she contemplated answers to questions she had never imagined needing to consider. "We take it one step at a time," she said, her voice carrying the same steady confidence that had guided them through years of uncertainty and challenge. We learn what we need to learn, we get help from people who know more than we do, and we make decisions based on what's right rather than what's easy or profitable. Margaret gathered the last of the legal documents, her work complete but her satisfaction in the outcome evident in her relaxed posture and genuine smile. James chose well, she said simply. He knew that character matters more than experience, that integrity is more valuable than industry knowledge, and that the best leaders are those who have learned to succeed despite obstacles rather than those who have never faced real challenges. As afternoon sunlight slanted through the study windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny celebrations in the golden air, Sarah felt a sense of completion that had been missing from her life for 15 years. The girl who had been cast aside for choosing love over financial security had become a woman whose character had ultimately proven worthy of trust and respect from the man who had initially rejected her choices. The adoption papers that had once seemed like mere formalities had proven to be the foundation for justice served and dignity restored. The family that had laughed at her presence at the funeral was now dependent on her generosity for their futures, and the son she had raised with carefully budgeted love was now guaranteed educational opportunities that would allow him to pursue any dream he chose to chase. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same study where her life had been transformed, but everything about the atmosphere had changed. The heavy curtains that had blocked natural light during James's final years were now pulled back, allowing sunshine to stream across the mahogany desk where she now reviewed construction contracts and employee benefit proposals. The formal portraits of stern-faced Hartwell ancestors had been joined by photographs of company picnics, charity events, and the smiling faces of employees who had discovered that their new owner valued their contributions in ways the previous generation never had. Tommy entered the study carrying 2 cups of coffee, a routine they had established during the months of learning to navigate their new responsibilities. At 17 now, he had grown into the role of his mother's closest advisor and sounding board, his sharp mind helping her process complex business decisions while his moral compass ensured they never lost sight of the values that had guided them through years of modest living. He had chosen to finish his senior year at Hartford High School rather than transferring to the elite private academy that his inheritance could now afford, preferring to graduate with friends who had known him before wealth changed his circumstances. The quarterly employee satisfaction surveys came back, Tommy said, settling into the chair that had once been reserved for James's most important business meetings. 94% positive ratings across all departments. The benefits package improvements and profit-sharing program are exactly what people needed. His pride in their accomplishments was evident, but it was tempered by the understanding that success meant responsibility for the welfare of over 200 families who depended on Hartwell Construction for their livelihoods. Sarah smiled as she reviewed the survey results, remembering the skeptical faces of longtime employees during her first company meeting 6 months earlier. They had gathered in the main conference room expecting to hear about layoffs, benefit cuts, or the sale of the company to corporate raiders who would strip assets and eliminate jobs to maximize short-term profits. Instead, they had listened in amazement as she outlined plans for increased healthcare coverage, educational assistance for employees' children, and performance bonuses tied to both individual achievement and company-wide success. The transformation hadn't been without challenges. 3 members of the management team had resigned rather than adapt to leadership that prioritized employee welfare alongside profit margins. Several longtime clients had initially questioned whether a woman with no construction experience could maintain the quality and reliability that had made Hartwell Construction a respected name in the industry. But the results spoke for themselves, with productivity up 15% and client satisfaction reaching record levels as employees worked harder for a boss who treated them as valuable partners rather than replaceable resources. Margaret Chen knocked on the study door, her visits now focused on business consultations rather than family crises. She had become Sarah's most trusted advisor during the transition, helping navigate complex corporate regulations while ensuring that every decision met both legal requirements and ethical standards. Her pride in Sarah's success was evident in the warmth of her smile as she entered the room carrying a folder of documents that would represent another milestone in the company's evolution. The Hartford Community Foundation has approved the scholarship program, Margaret announced, setting the folder on the desk with satisfaction. Starting next fall, Hartwell Construction will sponsor full college scholarships for 20 students from low-income families, with priority given to those interested in construction, engineering, or business management. The program is endowed with enough funding to continue indefinitely, creating a pipeline of educated workers who understand both industry skills and social responsibility. Tommy leaned forward to examine the scholarship criteria, noting with approval that academic achievement was balanced with community service and personal character assessments. "This is going to change lives," he said, thinking about classmates whose college dreams were limited by financial constraints. Some of these kids will become the next generation of ethical business leaders, and they'll remember that someone gave them a chance when they needed it most. Sarah felt a deep sense of completion reading through the scholarship program details. The anonymous donations she had made for years on a teacher's salary could now be formalized and expanded through systematic charitable giving that would impact hundreds of young people over time. The values that had guided her own struggles could now be institutionalized through programs that would outlast her personal involvement and create lasting positive change in the community. The intercom buzzed softly, and Sarah's assistant announced that David was asking to see her. The former heir
to the Hartwell empire had requested this meeting 3 times over the past month, each request becoming more humble and specific about his desire to discuss his future relationship with the family business. Sarah had agreed to see him today, curious about what had prompted his persistence and hoping that the months since the will reading had given him time to develop perspective on his changed circumstances. David entered the study looking remarkably different from the arrogant man who had dismissed Sarah's presence at the funeral. 6 months of working as a project supervisor for a small construction company had taught him lessons about genuine labor and earned respect that his privileged upbringing had never provided. His expensive suits had been replaced by practical work clothes, and his hands showed the calluses and minor scars that came from actual physical involvement in construction projects rather than merely overseeing others' work from comfortable offices. "Thank you for seeing me," David said, his voice carrying none of the condescension that had characterized their previous interactions. "I know I don't have any right to ask for your time or consideration, but I was hoping we could discuss the possibility of my returning to work for Hartwell Construction in some capacity." The request was made without expectation or demand, a marked contrast to his previous assumption that family position entitled him to leadership roles regardless of his qualifications or character. Sarah studied her adopted brother's face, noting the genuine humility that had replaced his earlier arrogance. "Tell me about what you've learned over the past 6 months," she said, gesturing for him to take a seat across from her desk. "What's been different about working for someone else compared to expecting to inherit a company?" Her tone was neither hostile nor encouraging, simply curious about whether David had experienced genuine growth or was merely adapting his approach to achieve his desired outcome. David settled into the chair carefully, his posture reflecting the respectful attention of someone who understood he was being evaluated rather than accommodated. "I learned that I never really understood construction work," he admitted, his voice carrying the weight of humbling discoveries. "I thought I knew the business because I had attended meetings and reviewed financial reports, but I had never actually built anything with my own hands or worked alongside the crews who do the real labor that makes projects successful." Tommy watched the interaction with interest, noting the changes in David's demeanor while remaining skeptical about whether the transformation was genuine or strategic. His mother had taught him to judge people by their actions over time rather than their words in moments of need, and David's track record of treating others with contempt would require significant evidence of change before earning forgiveness or trust. "I also learned," David continued, "that the way I treated service workers and employees wasn't just morally wrong but practically stupid. The people I dismissed as unimportant actually possess knowledge and skills that are essential for business success. The workers I looked down on have insights about efficiency, quality, and customer satisfaction that I never bothered to seek or value." His acknowledgement of past mistakes seemed genuine, but Sarah remained cautious about his motivations for seeking reconciliation. Margaret observed the conversation with professional interest, having witnessed numerous family reconciliation attempts over her decades of legal practice. She understood that genuine redemption required more than apologies and expressions of remorse. It demanded consistent demonstration of changed behavior over extended periods. David's humble request was encouraging, but his history of entitlement and cruelty would require substantial proof of transformation before warranting trust or opportunity. Sarah leaned back in her chair, considering how to respond to David's request in a way that would test his sincerity while protecting the company culture she had worked to establish. "If you're serious about wanting to work for Hartwell Construction," she said carefully, "it would have to be on the same terms as any other employee. No special consideration because of family relationships, no accelerated advancement based on previous connections, and absolutely no tolerance for the kind of behavior toward other workers that characterized your past interactions." David nodded quickly, his eagerness to accept any terms revealing how dramatically his circumstances and priorities had shifted. "I understand completely," he said. "I would expect to start at an entry-level position and earn any advancement through proven performance and character improvement. I know I have a lot to prove, not just to you but to employees who remember how I used to treat them when I thought I was their future boss." The admission that David recognized his need to rebuild relationships with workers he had previously mistreated suggested a level of self-awareness that had been entirely absent during his privileged years. Sarah appreciated his acknowledgement of past wrongs, but she also understood that good intentions would need to be sustained through months of consistent behavior before earning genuine respect from employees who had experienced his earlier contempt. Tommy spoke up for the first time during the meeting, his question direct and challenging. "What happens if Mom gives you a chance and you decide that manual labor is beneath you, or you get frustrated with having to earn respect instead of commanding it automatically? What's different now that would prevent you from reverting to your old attitudes when the work gets difficult or uncomfortable?" The question revealed Tommy's protective instincts toward his mother and his skepticism about whether privileged people could genuinely change their fundamental attitudes toward work and social hierarchy. David's response would need to address not just his current humility but his commitment to maintaining respectful behavior even when facing frustration or challenge. David met Tommy's challenging gaze directly, his response thoughtful rather than defensive. "The difference is that I've experienced what it's like to be judged purely on my own merit rather than my family connections. I've learned what it feels like to have my opinions dismissed and my contributions undervalued. I finally understand what I put other people through for years, and I never want to be that person again." The explanation carried emotional weight that suggested genuine learning rather than calculated manipulation, but Sarah knew that real change would only be proven through sustained behavior under pressure. "I'm willing to offer you a 6-month probationary position as a general laborer," she said after careful consideration. "Your wages and treatment will be identical to any other new hire, and your continued employment will depend entirely on your work quality and interactions with other employees." Margaret made notes about the employment terms, ensuring that David's hiring would be documented with the same thoroughness as any other personnel decision. The formal process would protect both the company and David from later disputes while establishing clear expectations and evaluation criteria that would apply regardless of family relationships or past history with the organization. David's relief at being offered any opportunity was evident in his relaxed posture and genuine smile. "Thank you," he said simply. "I know I don't deserve this chance, and I promise I won't waste it. I want to prove that I can be the kind of person who contributes to what you're building here rather than undermining it through arrogance or entitlement." Sarah felt cautiously optimistic about David's prospects for redemption while remaining realistic about the challenges he would face in rebuilding his character and relationships. The months ahead would test whether his humility was genuine transformation or temporary adaptation to circumstances, and his success would depend on his ability to maintain respectful behavior even when facing setbacks or frustrations. As David left the study, Tommy and Margaret exchanged glances that reflected shared skepticism tempered by hope for genuine change. They had both witnessed too many privileged individuals make promises of reform that evaporated when facing real challenges to their comfort or status, but they also understood that redemption required opportunities for people to prove their growth through action rather than words. The conversation had reminded Sarah of how dramatically her own circumstances had changed while reinforcing her commitment to using her position to create opportunities for others regardless of their past mistakes or current limitations. The wealth and power she had inherited came with responsibilities that extended beyond personal comfort to include the welfare of employees, the ethical operation of business practices, and the positive impact on community development. A soft knock interrupted their discussion, and Sarah's assistant announced that Rebecca was requesting a meeting. Unlike David's multiple attempts to schedule appointments, this was Rebecca's first contact since the will reading, and Sarah was curious about what had prompted her adopted sister to overcome 6 months of pride and resentment to seek reconciliation or assistance. Rebecca entered the study with visible nervousness, her designer clothing replaced by modest business attire that reflected her changed financial circumstances. The confidence and superiority that had characterized her earlier interactions had been replaced by uncertainty and what appeared to be genuine remorse for her past behavior. She carried herself with the careful humility of someone who understood she was seeking favor rather than claiming entitlement. "I want to apologize," Rebecca began without preamble, her voice lacking its previous sharp edge. "Not because I'm hoping for anything from you, but because I need to acknowledge how terribly I treated you throughout our childhood and especially at Dad's funeral. You deserved better from someone who should have been your sister, and I failed completely in that responsibility." The apology was offered without qualification or excuse, a marked contrast to Rebecca's previous tendency to justify her behavior through reference to social expectations or family traditions. Sarah appreciated the directness of the acknowledgement while remaining cautious about its implications for future interactions between them. Tommy noted the difference between Rebecca's approach and David's request for employment, recognizing that her apology seemed focused on moral reconciliation rather than practical benefits. Her body language suggested genuine shame about past behavior rather than strategic positioning for personal advantage, which gave her words more credibility than they might have carried from someone seeking specific favors or opportunities. Margaret observed Rebecca's demeanor with professional interest, noting the absence of the entitled expectations that had characterized her earlier interactions. The transformation appeared genuine, but Margaret's experience had taught her that crisis often prompted temporary changes in behavior that didn't necessarily reflect permanent shifts in character or values. "I've spent 6 months thinking about the kind of person I became," Rebecca continued, her voice carrying the weight of difficult self-examination. "I realized that I used my social position to make other people feel small because it made me feel important. I treated you badly because I was threatened by your kindness and strength, qualities that I had never developed in myself because I thought wealth and status were more valuable." Sarah listened carefully to Rebecca's confession, hearing echoes of her own struggles with identity and belonging during the years when she had tried to find her place within the Hartwell family structure. The recognition that Rebecca had felt threatened rather than simply dismissive added complexity to their relationship history and suggested possibilities for genuine understanding between them. "What made you decide to come here today?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious about the motivation behind Rebecca's visit. 6 months is a long time to spend thinking about apologies. "What changed that made you feel ready to have this conversation now?" Her question was intended to understand whether Rebecca's growth was prompted by external circumstances or internal development. Rebecca shifted uncomfortably in her chair before responding with obvious difficulty. "I lost most of my social circle when word got around about the inheritance situation. People who I thought were friends stopped including me in their activities when they realized I couldn't afford to participate in their lifestyle anymore. I discovered that my relationships were based on what I could provide rather than who I was as a person." The admission revealed the painful social consequences of Rebecca's reduced circumstances while highlighting her recognition that superficial relationships based on wealth and status offered no genuine support during difficult times. Her isolation had apparently prompted reflection about the value of authentic human connections over transactional social positioning. Tommy felt an unexpected surge of sympathy for Rebecca's social exile, understanding from his own experience how isolating it could feel to be excluded from groups where you had previously belonged. However, he also recognized that her current situation was largely the result of her own choices to prioritize status over character throughout her adult life. I realized, Rebecca continued, that you were the only person in our family who ever showed genuine kindness to others without expecting anything in return. While I was using people for social advancement, you were building real relationships based on mutual respect and care. I want to learn how to be that kind of person, but I don't even know where to start. The request for guidance rather than material assistance suggested that Rebecca's personal growth might be more significant than Sarah had initially assumed. The recognition that she needed to learn basic principles of human decency indicated both humility about her past failures and genuine desire for character development that went beyond simply adapting to changed circumstances. Sarah considered how to respond to Rebecca's request in a way that would encourage genuine growth while protecting herself from potential manipulation or disappointment. Character development isn't something that can be taught through lectures or advice, she said thoughtfully. It comes through practice, through making daily choices to put other people's welfare alongside your own, and through learning to find satisfaction in contributing to others' happiness rather than just your own. Margaret watched the interaction between the two women with interest, noting how Sarah's response emphasized action over intention and practice over theory. The approach reflected wisdom gained through years of actual service to others rather than theoretical understanding of moral principles, and it offered Rebecca a practical path forward that would require sustained effort rather than quick fixes. Rebecca nodded seriously, clearly understanding that Sarah was offering guidance rather than easy solutions. Would you be willing to let me volunteer for some of the charitable work that Hartwell Construction sponsors? I know I don't have any experience with actual service, but I'd like to learn by doing the work rather than just writing checks or attending fundraising parties. The request demonstrated that Rebecca understood the difference between performative charity and genuine service, suggesting that her months of reflection had produced insights about the shallow nature of her previous community involvement. Her willingness to engage in actual work rather than simply financial contributions indicated a recognition that character development required personal investment rather than monetary substitution. Sarah felt cautiously hopeful about Rebecca's prospects for genuine change while maintaining realistic expectations about the challenges involved in transforming lifelong patterns of entitled behavior. I can arrange for you to work with our community outreach coordinator, she said after consideration. But you should understand that this work involves direct service to people who are struggling, and it requires patience, humility, and genuine respect for everyone you encounter. The warning was offered kindly but firmly, ensuring that Rebecca understood the commitment she was making and the standards she would need to meet. Sarah's experience with volunteer work had taught her that good intentions weren't sufficient for effective service, and that working with vulnerable populations required emotional maturity and cultural sensitivity that couldn't be assumed or quickly developed. Rebecca accepted the conditions with evident relief at being offered any opportunity for redemption and growth. "Thank you," she said simply. "I know I have a lot to prove, and I understand that changing who I am will take time and consistent effort. I just want the chance to become someone worthy of being called your sister." The conversation ended with tentative hope for healing relationships that had been damaged by years of inequality and resentment. Sarah felt satisfied that she had offered appropriate opportunities for both David and Rebecca to demonstrate genuine change while protecting the company culture and charitable work that had become central to her new responsibilities. As the afternoon sun slanted through the study windows, Sarah reflected on how completely her life had been transformed by the adoption papers that had initially seemed like mere legal formalities. The documents that established her identity as James Hartwell's daughter had ultimately provided the foundation for justice served and dignity restored, proving that legal protections for adopted children carried real weight when supported by moral character and consistent behavior. Tommy gathered the scholarship program materials, his movements reflecting the confident efficiency he had developed during months of helping his mother navigate complex business decisions.
At 17, he had gained insights about leadership, responsibility, and human nature that most people never acquired, and his character had been strengthened rather than corrupted by exposure to wealth and power. The house that had never felt like home during Sarah's childhood had been transformed into a place of warmth and inclusion where business decisions were guided by moral principles rather than pure profit considerations. The study where James had once delivered harsh judgments about family loyalty and social obligations now served as headquarters for charitable work and ethical business practices that honored both his memory and Sarah's values. Margaret Chen prepared to leave, her satisfaction with the day's outcomes evident in her relaxed demeanor and genuine smile. "James would be proud of what you've accomplished," she said, gathering her legal documents with the satisfaction of someone whose decades of work had finally produced the kind of justice that made legal practice meaningful rather than merely profitable. As evening approached, Sarah stood at the study windows overlooking gardens that were now maintained by employees who received fair wages and comprehensive benefits rather than by the cheap labor that had once subsidized the family's comfort. The view reminded her of all the times during her childhood when she had looked out these same windows and wondered if she would ever truly belong anywhere or with anyone. The adoption papers that had made her a Hartwell in name had ultimately made her a leader in practice, someone whose character had been tested by adversity and proven worthy of trust and responsibility. The family that had rejected her had been replaced by a community of employees, volunteers, and beneficiaries who respected her leadership because it was earned through service rather than inherited through accident of birth. Tommy joined her at the window, his presence a reminder that the most important relationship in her life had been built through love and mutual support rather than legal documents or social expectations. Together they had navigated poverty, social exclusion, and sudden wealth while maintaining the values that defined their identity as people who measured success by their positive impact on others rather than by their accumulation of material possessions. The construction company that had once been a symbol of social status and financial power had been transformed into a vehicle for community development and worker empowerment, proving that business success and ethical behavior were not only compatible but mutually reinforcing when guided by leaders who understood that profit was a tool for positive change rather than an end in itself. 6 months after the will reading that had shocked a family and vindicated a lifetime of quiet service, Sarah Mitchell stood in her inherited study surrounded by evidence of transformation that extended far beyond her own circumstances. The ripple effects of justice served had created opportunities for employee advancement, community development, and charitable work that would impact hundreds of lives for generations to come. The girl who had been cast aside for choosing love over financial security had become a woman whose character ultimately provided the foundation for wealth used responsibly and power exercised with humility. The adoption papers that had once seemed like mere formalities had proven to be the legal framework for a life that exemplified the values that truly matter in measuring human worth and family loyalty. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.